The fork slipped from my hand the second the words left his mouth. The clatter against the plate echoed louder than the TV humming in the background, louder than the scraping of chairs and the half-hearted laughter that had been circling the table just moments before. My brother sat across from me, chewing his roast chicken as if he hadn't just cracked open a scar I'd been trying to keep stitched. "Being trans means you'll never be normal," he said, shrugging like it was nothing more than a casual observation. His voice carried the same careless tone he used when pointing out the weather or debating which football team was better. He didn't look up, didn't seem to notice how his words burned the air. But I noticed. I felt them sink into me like glass. My mother glanced quickly at her plate, pushing mashed potatoes around with her fork, and my father cleared his throat, as though maybe the sound could smooth over the jagged edges of what had just been said. No one told him to stop. No one said it was cruel. The silence stretched, thick and suffocating, and I was left sitting in it, trying not to drown. I wanted to answer, to push back, to remind him that I wasn't asking to be normal, that I was asking to be me. But my tongue froze. My chest tightened. The kitchen lights buzzed overhead, casting everything in a harsh yellow glow that made me feel exposed, like every eye, even the ones that refused to meet mine, was silently agreeing with him. I pressed my palms against my thighs beneath the table, nails digging into fabric, anchoring myself to the moment. If I moved, if I spoke, I might shatter. And there, between the smell of gravy and the sound of cutlery, I realized just how fragile my place at this table really was. He went back to his meal as if nothing had happened. But the words stayed lodged in me, heavy and sharp. "You'll never be normal." And for the rest of the dinner, I could taste nothing but that. The words didn't leave me when dinner ended. They followed me up the staircase, clinging to my clothes, trailing into my room like an unwanted guest. "Being trans means you'll never be normal." I shut the door, leaned against it, and let the sound of his voice replay until it was unbearable. My chest ached with the weight of it. My stomach twisted. It wasn't new, not really, just another verse in a song I'd been hearing for years, but the sting was fresh all the same. I sat on the edge of my bed and thought about the way everyone else at the table had reacted. Or rather, how they hadn't. My mother's silence, my father's throat clearing, the way no one pushed back against him. That silence spoke louder than the insult itself. It told me they agreed, or at the very least, that they didn't care enough to defend me. It wasn't just about tonight. It never is. It was about every echo from the past that statement dragged with it. I thought about middle school, when a teacher misgendered me in front of the class and kids snickered as if my existence were the punchline of a joke. I thought about locker rooms where I learned to hold my breath, to change clothes in bathroom stalls, to avoid the mirrors that told a truth my body wasn't ready to show. I thought about my father's disappointment when I came out, the way his jaw clenched as though I'd spat in his face instead of revealing my truth. Normal. That word had been dangled in front of me like a prize I could never win. It lived in the way relatives said, "Why can't you just," followed by a pause too heavy to finish. It lived in the questions from strangers who wanted to dissect me, to measure how close I came to the lines they drew for gender. It lived in the looks I got at grocery stores, glances that lingered just long enough to remind me I didn't blend, that I stood out in ways I never asked to. My brother's words weren't original. They were a chorus I had heard so many times I could mouth along with it. But hearing them at the family dinner table, spoken so casually, hurt in a way that felt almost unbearable. He said it like it was fact, as if there was no argument, no room for another story. "You'll never be normal." And in the silence that followed, I almost believed him. Because what is normal, really? It's Sunday dinners with no sharp edges. It's photos on the mantle where everyone smiles without strain. It's moving through the world without feeling like a spectacle. And me? I'd never had that. Even in moments of peace, I'd always been aware of how precarious it was, how quickly it could be broken with one careless comment. I remembered being 14, sitting in a doctor's office, trying to explain that the body I had didn't fit the person I was. The doctor's eyebrows arched, her voice too bright as she said, "This is just a phase. You'll grow out of it." My mother had sighed with relief beside me, and I had shrunk into my chair, convinced for a moment that maybe they were right, that my truth was nothing but a mistake waiting to be corrected. Those moments don't fade. They embed themselves. So when my brother spoke, it wasn't just his voice I heard. It was every teacher, every stranger, every doctor, every parent who had ever suggested that my identity was an obstacle to the life I wanted. His voice was the sum of them all, thrown into the room like a knife I couldn't dodge. And yet, beneath the pain, there was something else, something I didn't want to admit. A sliver of fear that maybe he was right. That maybe I really would never know the ease of normal. That maybe my life would always be measured by what it wasn't, instead of what it was. That fear kept me awake long after the house had gone quiet. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, feeling the shame rise and fall with my breath. The word normal beat against my ribs like a drum. Normal meant acceptable. Normal meant lovable. Normal meant safe. And if I could never have that, what did that make me? It made me something else, something they didn't have a word for, something they couldn't hold in their frames or explain to their friends. And sometimes, that terrified me. Because being unrecognizable in their eyes meant being unprotected. It meant standing outside, watching everyone else eat their dinners in peace. At dinner that night, I had stayed silent. But in my head, I screamed. I screamed at the injustice of it, at the way he got to speak without consequence while I had to swallow every sharp edge that lodged in my throat. I screamed at the way silence from the others felt like a verdict. And I screamed at myself, too, for not fighting back, for not proving in that moment that I was more than his careless cruelty. But maybe that was the deepest pain of all, realizing that no quick retort, no clever defense, could undo the years of rejection that had piled up behind his words. It wasn't about one dinner. It was about a lifetime of being told in 1,000 ways that who I was would never be enough. And yet, even in that pit of pain, something stirred. A tiny ember, the same one that had flickered before in moments of humiliation. A whisper underneath his words that said, "You were not what he calls you. You were not defined by their silence." It was faint, drowned out by the roar of shame, but it was there. I pressed my palms against my chest, felt my heartbeat thudding, and held on to that ember. Because if I didn't, I knew I'd lose myself completely. The night after dinner, I lay awake staring at the cracks in the ceiling like they might spell out answers. The house was quiet, save for the creak of pipes and the occasional groan of the wind against the siding. But inside me, everything was loud. My brother's words repeated like a drumbeat, "Being trans means you'll never be normal." Each time they echoed, they struck harder, as though my ribs were a bell and he had struck it with a hammer. I replayed the scene, over and over. His smirk, casual as the condensation on his glass. My mother's silence. My father's throat clearing. The scrape of forks on plates that carried on like nothing had happened. And me frozen, suffocating in my own skin. I hated myself in that moment. Not for being trans, but for being quiet. For letting the words hang there, unchallenged. For not demanding better. I curled into myself, fists pressed against my chest, whispering into the dark, "Why didn't you say something? Why didn't you fight back?" But the truth was, I had been fighting my whole life. Every day of existing as myself in a world that wanted me erased was already a battle. And I was tired. Too tired to swing back at every strike, too tired to bleed on command just to prove my right to live. Still, lying there in the dark, I realized something. I couldn't keep letting their voices win. I couldn't keep swallowing my rage until it soured into silence. Somewhere between midnight and dawn, I made a vow. It wasn't dramatic. No lightning bolt lit up the sky. No triumphant music swelled. It was quieter, but heavier, like a stone sinking into the deepest part of me. No more. No more shrinking so they could feel bigger. No more hiding so they could feel comfortable. No more letting their shame masquerade as mine. If they thought being trans meant I would never be normal, then maybe normal was never the prize I wanted anyway. Maybe I was meant for something else. The vow didn't erase the pain. It didn't stop the doubts from whispering. In fact, the nights that followed were some of the hardest. I tossed and turned, sleep slipping from me as rage and despair tangled in my chest. I wrote pages in my journal, pen digging so hard into the paper it almost tore. I wrote the word normal until it blurred. I wrote no more until it steadied me. Some nights, I paced my room, muttering to myself, half in fury, half in desperation. I'll show them. I'll show him. I'll show all of them. Not with fists, not with screams, but with something heavier, proof. Proof that my life was not a tragedy, not a blemish, not a mistake. Proof that my existence was not a ruin, but a force. The vow became a kind of prayer. I whispered it brushing my teeth, lacing my shoes, staring at my reflection in the mirror that once felt like an enemy. No more. Each repetition stitched it deeper into my bones, turning it from a thought into a promise. And yet, beneath the fire, there was still fear. What if I failed? What if I tried to rise and only fell harder? What if their voices were right, and I would always be on the outside looking in? The doubts haunted me, coiling around the edges of my determination. But I carried them with me anyway, because the alternative, continuing to disappear, was worse. I thought about my younger self, that kid hiding in bathroom stalls, that teenager staring at the ceiling with tears staining the pillow. I thought about how badly they had needed someone to show them another way. And I realized I could become that someone not just for myself, but for others too. My vow wasn't only personal. It was survival, yes, but also rebellion. A refusal to let anyone else sit at a dinner table, silenced, believing they were unworthy of existence. That thought gave me strength when exhaustion pulled me under. It became the anchor I clung to when doubt screamed louder than courage. So I began to carry the vow like armor. At first it was invisible, only felt in my chest. But slowly, I started to let it guide my choices. I refused invitations that required me to shrink. I cut my hair the way I had always wanted, not the way others thought softened me. I spoke my name louder at introductions, even when my voice trembled. The vow demanded more than survival, it demanded growth. It demanded that I become someone who could not be ignored, no matter how many times they tried to pretend I wasn't there. Of course, my brother's words didn't vanish. They haunted me in quiet moments, rising uninvited like ghosts. But each time they came, I used them as fuel. If he thought I'd never be normal, then I would become something better, undeniable. And in the darkest hours of the night, when I whispered no more into the silence, I felt the ember of transformation catch fire. The vow began as a whisper, but soon it threaded itself into everything I did. It was there when I woke, when I dressed, when I spoke. No more. Each morning, the words steadied me, even on days when my stomach knotted with doubt. They didn't erase the pain, but they gave me a direction. The first visible shift was small. I stopped dressing for their comfort. For years I had chosen clothes that kept the peace, soft sweaters, muted colors, outfits that blurred the lines of who I was so no one would point or question. But after the vow, I went shopping for myself. I picked out a jacket that hugged my shoulders just right, shoes that gave weight to my steps, shirts that made me feel aligned in my own skin. When I stepped out in them, I felt nervous, exposed. But I also felt alive. I started walking differently. Not hunched or apologetic, but upright, even if my chest burned with the effort. People still stared sometimes, but I noticed something. The more I stood in my truth, the less their stares cut me. My brother's words, "You'll never be normal," still rang in my ears, but instead of shrinking, I used them as fuel. If I couldn't be normal, I would be undeniable. At work, I stopped hiding too. I corrected people when they slipped on my pronouns. At first my voice shook, my palms sweating, but the more I said it, the steadier it became. And slowly, people adjusted. They began to see me, not the ghost I had tried to present, but me. One day, a coworker asked me to lead a new project, and instead of hesitating, I said yes. Standing in front of the room, presenting ideas, I felt the old fear creep in, but behind it was something stronger, a sense that I belonged. Not because I'd been invited, but because I claimed it. Outside of work, I sought out people who understood. A friend introduced me to a local LGBTQ group that met every Thursday night in the basement of a cafe. The first time I went, I hovered at the door, my vow the only thing keeping me from running. But when I finally stepped inside, I was greeted with smiles that didn't flinch, voices that didn't falter, names and pronouns exchanged with casual grace. For the first time in years, I exhaled without realizing I'd been holding my breath. Those nights became my anchor. We shared stories, funny, painful, raw. We laughed until our sides hurt, cried without shame, and stitched together a kind of family that didn't demand silence in exchange for love. They reminded me that my life was not a problem but a possibility. That being trans didn't make me broken, it made me whole in a way most people never had to fight for. The vow grew roots in that soil. I found myself volunteering to speak at events, sharing my story with teenagers who sat the way I once had, small, tense, waiting for someone to tell them they weren't a mistake. Standing at the microphone, I told them the truth, that being trans did not ruin them, that they were not destined for loneliness, that normal was a cage they didn't need to fit into. Their eyes lit up, and I knew I was planting seeds, the same way others had unknowingly planted them in me. Each insult I remembered, each silence from my family, became energy. My brother's voice no longer rang as a sentence. It rang as a challenge. He said I'd never be normal. Then I would be extraordinary. He said I'd ruin things. Then I would build things so strong they could never be erased. I poured myself into my work at the nonprofit, launching programs that connected trans youth with mentors, creating safe spaces where no one had to whisper their identity like a shameful secret. When one of our events made the local paper, I kept a copy. Not because I craved recognition, but because it was proof. Proof that I was visible, undeniable, unashamed. And still, the transformation wasn't all smooth. There were nights I collapsed into bed, exhausted from the weight of pushing back against a world that didn't always want me. There were days I caught sight of myself in a mirror and flinched before steadying my gaze again. But the difference was, I no longer let those moments undo me. Pain didn't mean I was failing. It meant I was growing. I found joy too, joy sharper and sweeter than I had ever known. I danced at queer nights until sweat dripped down my back, sang loudly in cars with friends who loved me, kissed under streetlights without fear of who might see. Joy became its own form of defiance. Because for every voice that said I'd never be normal, my laughter was the rebuttal. One evening, walking home from a fundraiser we'd organized, I caught my reflection in a shop window. For a moment, I didn't recognize myself. Not because I looked wrong, but because I looked whole. The person staring back was not the kid hunched in silence at family dinners, not the teenager hiding in bathroom stalls, not the adult shrinking in the corner at weddings. The person staring back was me, visible, proud, alive. And I realized then that the vow had already come true. No more. I was no longer erasing myself. No longer letting their shame dictate my worth. My brother's words had once felt like a curse, but now they were the reason I had built a life beyond their limits. I wasn't normal. And that was the point. The chance to confront my brother came sooner than I expected. It wasn't planned, not some cinematic showdown I'd been rehearsing in my head. It was at another family dinner, months later, when my mother called everyone over to celebrate my father's birthday. A simple meal, a cake, a few candles, that was all it was supposed to be. But the weight of unfinished business sat heavy in the room before the food was even served. I walked into the house with my head high, my tailored jacket fitting like armor, my vow whispering steady beneath my breath, no more. The air smelled like garlic bread and tomato sauce, but underneath it lingered something sharper, tension. My brother was already at the table, leaning back in his chair, his phone glowing in his hand. When he glanced up and saw me, his smirk flickered, almost faltered, before he covered it with a scoff. I sat down anyway. I didn't shrink, didn't fold my hands like a guest afraid of overstaying. I took my place at the table like it belonged to me, because it did. Dinner began in the usual half-hearted chatter. My mother asked about work, my father grumbled about the weather, my sister fussed with the bread basket. I answered calmly, without apology, speaking about the mentorship program I had launched, the essays I'd published. I spoke with the quiet confidence I had earned, letting my words fill the space I had once vacated. But my brother couldn't leave it alone. He set his fork down, leaned back, and with the same careless tone as before, said, "So what, you think you're normal now?" The words landed like a stone in the middle of the table. Everyone froze. The clinking of cutlery stopped. My mother's eyes darted to her plate, my father cleared his throat, my sister chewed too quickly. But this time, I didn't freeze. I looked at him, steady and unflinching. "I never said I was normal," I replied, my voice calm but firm. "Because normal isn't the goal. Being myself is." His smirk faltered. He hadn't expected me to answer, not like that. He expected silence, maybe a stammer, maybe a retreat. But I gave him none of those. I gave him truth. The silence stretched, thicker than before, but this time I didn't drown in it. I let it settle, let it expose the cracks in the room. Then I added, "And if you think that makes me less, that says more about you than it does about me." My mother shifted uncomfortably. My father cleared his throat again, louder this time, as if trying to cough away the confrontation. But I didn't look at them. I kept my eyes on my brother, refusing to give him the satisfaction of turning away. For a long moment, he said nothing. His jaw worked, his fingers tapped against the table, but he didn't have a retort ready. The power of his words had always come from the silence that followed them, the way no one challenged him. But now, that silence was broken. Finally, he muttered, "You're so dramatic," and looked back at his plate. But it was hollow. The edge was gone. He had no ground left to stand on. I breathed in, slow and steady. My hands trembled under the table, but my voice hadn't wavered. And that was enough. The rest of dinner passed in uneasy quiet. Conversation sputtered and restarted, but something fundamental had shifted. I wasn't the shadow at the table anymore. I wasn't the one shrinking into invisibility. I had claimed my space, spoken my truth, and left his cruelty exposed for what it was, weak. Later, as the cake was served, my sister glanced at me across the table. There was something in her eyes I hadn't seen before, not quite admiration, not yet apology, but recognition. A flicker of understanding that maybe I wasn't the problem she'd always thought I was. And when the family photo was taken at the end of the night, I didn't step aside. I stood where I wanted, shoulders square, smile calm. The camera flashed, and I thought again of that old whisper, "You'll ruin the photos." But the picture wasn't ruined. It was real. And I was in it, unshaken. Walking out of the house that night, the air crisp against my face, I felt lighter. The confrontation hadn't been explosive. There were no raised voices, no dramatic scenes. But that was the point. The real confrontation wasn't about tearing him down, it was about refusing to let him tear me down anymore. It was about showing him, and everyone else at that table, that I wasn't going anywhere. The vow I had made in the quiet of my room had carried me here, to this table, to this moment of unflinching truth. And in that moment, I realized something powerful. I didn't need their acceptance to be whole. I didn't need their approval to thrive. I just needed to live. And I was doing exactly that. After that dinner, something subtle but irreversible shifted in me. It wasn't triumph, not in the way movies portray it, with dramatic music swelling and villains vanquished. My brother didn't storm off in shame, my parents didn't suddenly rise from the table to embrace me with unconditional love. But for the first time, I had sat at that table without shrinking. I had spoken, and my voice hadn't cracked into silence. That, I realized, was its own kind of victory. In the days that followed, I noticed how little power his words held over me now. They didn't echo in my head the way they once had. They no longer sent me pacing my room or scribbling desperate lines into my journal. Instead, they seemed small, almost pitiful, compared to the life I was building. His definition of normal was narrow, fragile, bound by walls I no longer wanted to live inside. My life had stretched far beyond those walls. I had work that mattered, friendships that nourished me, a community that celebrated me. I had joy, a joy that shimmered not in spite of my transness but because of it. The very thing he called abnormal had become the root of my strength, my creativity, my resilience. I found myself saying yes to things I once would have turned down out of fear. A coworker invited me to give a talk at a university panel on LGBTQ advocacy, and though my hands shook as I adjusted the microphone, I spoke anyway. The students leaned forward, listening, some with tears in their eyes. Afterward, one of them hugged me tightly and whispered, "Thank you. I didn't know if I could make it, but now I think maybe I can." That moment filled me in a way my family's approval never could. Love came into my life, too, not the conditional, strained love I'd begged from relatives, but a love rooted in recognition. My partner saw me fully, without hesitation or caveats. They laughed with me, held me through dark nights, and celebrated my victories with a pride that felt like sunlight. When we danced together at a queer wedding one summer evening, spinning under strings of lights, I thought, this is my normal. This is enough. And my chosen family expanded. Friends who felt like siblings gathered at my table for potlucks, bringing mismatched chairs and dishes passed down from apartments. We told stories, clinked glasses, argued over board games, and laughed until the neighbors banged on the wall. Those nights filled the hollow spaces left by blood ties that had frayed. The love we shared was deliberate, chosen every day, and it was stronger for it. My biological family still hovered at the edges of my life. There were gatherings where the tension hummed, where old habits resurfaced, where silence pressed heavy. But I no longer let their discomfort dictate my worth. If they shifted uneasily when I spoke, that was their burden. If they stumbled over my pronouns, I corrected them without apology. I wasn't there to be their secret or their shame. I was there as myself, and whether they accepted that or not no longer defined me. The revenge, if I could call it that, wasn't in proving them wrong directly. It was in living so fully that their narrow vision couldn't contain me. Every laugh, every success, every act of love was a quiet rebellion against their attempts to box me in. My brother had once told me I'd never be normal, and he was right, but not in the way he meant. I wasn't normal. I was extraordinary, alive in a way that ordinary could never capture. One evening, as I prepared slides for a keynote speech I'd been invited to give at a national conference, I paused to think about the journey. I remembered the night after his words first pierced me, the vow I had whispered into the dark, no more. I had no idea then how much that vow would reshape me, how much it would carry me through the fire into something brighter. When I stood on that stage, facing a room of hundreds, I didn't feel small. I didn't feel like the shadow at the table. I felt like someone who had built a life worth standing in the spotlight for. I spoke about resilience, about the power of living authentically, about how shame only wins when we accept it as truth. And when the audience rose in a standing ovation, I thought about my brother. About how little he understood, how much he had tried to diminish me with one careless sentence. If he could see me now, would he feel regret? Maybe. Maybe not. But it didn't matter. His opinion no longer had the power to shape my reflection. Because here was the truth, I had built a life where his words couldn't reach. A life where joy bloomed in places shame once lived. A life where I didn't just survive, I thrived. And when I looked at the faces in that audience, or at the laughter around my dinner table with friends, or into the eyes of the person who loved me, I knew with unshakable certainty, I had kept my vow. No more. My brother thought he was handing me a truth that night at the table. Being trans means you'll never be normal. He said it like it was a fact carved in stone, like something I was meant to carry for the rest of my life. And for a while, I did. I carried it like a chain, dragging it behind me, mistaking its weight for destiny. But chains can be broken. What he didn't understand, and what I didn't yet know, was that normal was never the prize. Normal was silence. Normal was invisibility. Normal was erasure. And I had spent too many years suffocating under that disguise. The vow I made, no more, wasn't about becoming what he wanted. It was about refusing to disappear for his comfort. It was about creating a life that thrived outside of his definitions, a life that glowed with the kind of joy that can't be hidden. And now, when I think about his words, I don't feel broken. I feel free. Free because he was right. I will never be normal. I will never blend into the small boxes his world allows. But I was never meant to. Instead, I am visible. I am undeniable. I am living a life richer than anything he could have imagined when he tried to cut me down. The revenge was never in shouting him down, never in proving him wrong on his terms. The revenge was in thriving. In love that holds me without hesitation. In friendships that see me whole. In work that saves lives, including my own. In joy so bright it spills over the edges of every wound they ever gave me. So let him keep his word, normal. He can hold it like a trophy if he wants. I don't need it. Because I have something greater. I have a life that is mine. I have the vow that carried me through. I have the proof written in every smile, every laugh, every step I take forward. He thought he defined me that night. But he didn't. I define myself. And I will never be normal. I will be unforgettable.